The USS Liberty Dawn had gone quiet. Not radio silent, not dimmed for stealth operations, dead silent. For 3 days, the Navy's most advanced aircraft carrier, a $13 billion testament to modern warfare, had been adrift in the South China Sea without propulsion. Its twin nuclear reactors were operational. Electrical systems, comms, radar, even catapults all functional. But the ship wouldn't move. No thrust, no response from the quantum-integrated propulsion control. Just thousands of tons of steel floating like a corpse in contested waters. Commander Brett Rourke stood on the bridge at 0640, hands behind his back, watching gray water stretch endlessly beyond the flight deck. Behind him, the watch team operated on automatic, exhaustion written into every movement. The Pentagon was calling every 2 hours. Defense contractors had flown in their elite from San Diego, Norfolk, and even Tel Aviv. Lockheed's lead software engineer was now sleeping on the mess hall floor. And still, nothing. Chief Engineer Keon Mitchell had been up for 67 hours. He was a systems genius, known across the fleet for patching AI-driven engines even during live-fire exercises. But this time, he had nothing. Every attempt to override the ship's integrated navigation logic failed. Hard resets triggered nested loops. Subroutines ignored manual commands. Even direct inputs at the engineering console resulted in silence. By 1320, on the third day, satellite surveillance confirmed 6 Chinese destroyers and 2 planned submarines shadowing just outside the 12 nautical mile limit. A pair of J-16 fighters had buzzed overhead that morning at 500 feet, barely staying on their side of international airspace. The show of restraint was almost mocking. The carrier strike group's escorts USS Brackett, USS Monroe, and a pair of Arleigh Burkes held defensive positions. But everyone on board knew they were vulnerable. If Liberty Dawn couldn't maneuver, it couldn't fight. And if it couldn't fight, it couldn't deter. Tensions inside the CIC were brittle. Lieutenant Hannah Cruz, the tactical officer, stared at a blinking screen that had looked the same for 72 hours. She had suggested a decoy broadcast, something to give the Chinese the illusion the ship was repositioning. Rourke had denied it. They couldn't risk being caught bluffing. At 1855, Admiral John Tennant from Indopacom called directly into the secure line. His voice was flat. He wanted an update for the Joint Chiefs before the 20:00 briefing. Rourke had to tell him what everyone already knew. No progress. The Admiral didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The silence after that call was heavier than anything said. That night, rain swept across the deck as MH-60R Seahawks maintained overwatch in slow, lazy circles. It was for show. Everyone on those birds knew if the Chinese launched an attack, they wouldn't have the thrust vectoring advantage of a maneuverable ship. And the Chinese knew it too. Below deck, in the propulsion core, the engineers were no longer arguing. The room was too tired for ego. Whiteboards were covered in layers of overlapping equations, obsolete now. Engineers whispered about sabotage, others about AI failure. But the truth was worse. No one even knew where to start looking anymore. At 0312, Rourke walked the passageway outside Central Control alone. His uniform was soaked from a leak dripping through the overhead, his boots heavy. He paused beside a hatch, hand resting on the metal. He wasn't thinking about orders or PR fallout or even diplomacy. He was thinking about the 5,000 lives aboard his ship, the ones who trusted him to keep them moving. He whispered something to himself no one else heard. Then he turned and kept walking, because the sun would rise in 3 hours, and the ship would still be dead in the water. The MH-60S Seahawk came in low at 0743, its rotor wash cutting sharp lines through the morning haze. Crew on the deck turned instinctively, forming the practiced perimeter as the helo settled. Another tech team, someone muttered, shielding his eyes. No one expected the woman who stepped out first. She wasn't in uniform. No flight suit, no insignia, just dark jeans, scuffed boots, and a navy button-down shirt rolled to the elbows. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a functional knot. She carried no gear, no laptop, not even a handheld diagnostic, only a worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder. She paused for one moment, eyes sweeping the deck like she'd been here before. Lieutenant Commander Jim Rourke met her halfway across the deck. He checked her clearance tablet, blinked once, then checked it again. The document was authentic, level Omega, signed by Joint Chiefs Command. Still, she offered no handshake, no explanation, only a calm voice. Engineering. Now. At 08:02, she entered the main propulsion deck. Dozens of contractors, engineers, and officers clustered around digital schematics and diagnostic displays. A week ago, this would have been the most secure space on the ship. Today, it looked like the floor of a Silicon Valley startup after a power outage. Tension, clutter, coffee stains, and desperation. Chief Engineer Keon Mitchell glanced up when she entered. His expression flickered between suspicion and exhaustion. She didn't wait for introductions. She stepped between two defense contractors arguing over a readout, glanced at the diagnostic display, and pointed, "This schematic is post-integration. I need the raw baseline, pre-mod architecture." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "This is the original file." She didn't look up. "No, it's not." She was already moving, eyes scanning the projection as if she'd seen it printed in her sleep. "This overlay has Lockheed Phase 4 formatting. I want the native framework." A junior analyst started to object, but Mitchell waved him off. "Pull it," he said. Her tone hadn't been aggressive, just certain, quietly certain, and in that room, certainty had become rare. By 08:35, she was at the console. She didn't ask for help, didn't ask for space, just keyed into a restricted engineering shell and began querying the propulsion subsystem logs. She worked fast, not chaotic, controlled. A few heads began turning. Mitchell watched from across the bay. His lead software tech, Ruiz, whispered to him. She bypassed the input bridge. "That's not a public path." Mitchell didn't respond. He was watching her hands. No hesitation. No wasted motion. At 09:12, she froze. Not from confusion, more like recognition. She tapped a command, paused, then leaned back slightly. "This segment," she said, motioning toward a section of code looping silently on the secondary monitor. "That's recursive masking. Someone embedded a conditional suppressor in the fault detection tree. That's why your tests fail without logging errors." The room went quiet. Ruiz stepped closer. "That's not possible. Our watchdog protocol would flag any core logic interference." The woman finally looked at him, unless it was written before the watchdog was installed. Mitchell crossed his arms. "You mind telling me who you are?" She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than comfortable, then turned back to the screen. "You can call me Rivers. That's all you need for now." At 09:45, the door opened behind her. Master Chief Ellis stood at the threshold. He was headed to deliver a system report but stopped mid-step when he saw her. His jaw tightened, then his eyes widened. He said nothing. She glanced over, noticed him, and nodded once. He returned the nod sharp, respectful, like it meant something more than it looked. Mitchell noticed. "You know her?" Ellis hesitated. "Not really. But I've heard of her. Long time ago." By 10:05, engineers had started hovering, not asking questions, just watching. Something about the way she moved told them she didn't need to be told how this system was built. She knew. Not just how it worked now, but how it was meant to work before the upgrades, the modifications, the overhauls done by people who didn't understand what they had. She didn't ask to lead. She didn't ask for anyone's opinion. She asked for the true source code, and the room gave it to her. Outside, the sea remained calm, but inside the ship, Something had shifted. For the first time in 3 days, there was motion. Not in the engines, in the people. Someone knew what they were looking at, and it wasn't who they expected. By 12:15, Madeline Rivers had claimed a corner of the propulsion control bay without being asked. She didn't take over the room. She just worked. A laptop, 3 cables, a portable power node. She requested them in short, direct phrases. No titles, no explanations. Just, I need root access to the quantum core shell. Or, bring me the precompiled command hierarchy from Phase 0 builds. The odd part wasn't the requests, it was that they were granted. Quickly. No one said no. Chief Mitchell hadn't approved anyone touching the Q-core system in over a year. Too many dependencies. Too much proprietary code that no one fully understood. But she had already bypassed 2 of the embedded locks without triggering fail-safe shutdowns. That alone told him she wasn't guessing. The way her fingers moved. The way she paused for a half-second before each query, as if recalling something written a lifetime ago, made even the senior engineers uneasy. At 13:00 she had a private feed running from the ship's deepest logic modules. Mitchell leaned in quietly. You realize that if you trip one wrong protocol in there, the entire system's going to go into lockdown. She didn't look up. That would only happen if someone hard-coded override blocks into a security proxy. This system doesn't have one. He blinked. And how exactly do you know that? Because I didn't design it that way. No one responded. A few engineers glanced at each other, trying to make sense of what she'd just said, but she was already back to work. By 14:10, a growing number of specialists had stopped trying to troubleshoot the current error tree. They were watching her. Quietly. Mitchell's second-in-command, Lieutenant Raul Ochoa, whispered near the back of the room. She's not just familiar with the architecture. She knows it. Like, intimately. Mitchell didn't answer. He was watching too. She requested a physical bypass of the quantum core's telemetry feedback loop. No one had dared to touch it, not since the firmware overhaul 2 years ago. Doing so required physically unlocking a reinforced compartment beneath the floor deck and connecting a custom interface node that hadn't been used since the carrier's commissioning trial. At 15:22, 2 junior officers wheeled in the interface crate. She opened it without hesitation. Her fingers hovered just above the housing port. Then she stopped, turned slightly. I need to do this alone. Mitchell hesitated. Absolutely not. No one works solo inside the Q-core perimeter. She finally looked at him. You'll have visual. I won't move outside the footprint. But if I do this with 5 people breathing down my neck, we're going to lose another day. And we don't have that kind of time. He didn't like it, but he didn't say no. By 16:00, she was inside the access cradle, sitting cross-legged like a field tech in a high school robotics lab. Except this wasn't robotics. This was a multi-billion-dollar propulsion brain embedded in the most advanced warship afloat. No notes. No cheat sheets. She didn't plug in diagnostics. She traced cable paths with her fingers, matched pulse patterns with what she remembered. And then, she started rewriting code. By 17:15, the room was silent except for the occasional alert tone or faint hiss of a heat vent. And in the middle of that silence, surrounded by trained professionals from the Navy and its top contractors, a civilian woman in old boots was solving a problem that no one else had understood in 3 days. Subpart 3.2. The night watch was quiet by 23:47. Most of the propulsion team had rotated out. The core ran in standby while Madeline continued working in her isolated zone near the forward systems cradle. Only red lights illuminated the bay now, casting long shadows. Master Chief Ellis returned with 2 black coffees and approached the perimeter quietly. She didn't turn when he arrived, just reached for the coffee when he placed it beside her. It's been years, he said softly. You remember me? I remember everyone from the USS Tacoma, she replied, still typing. He nodded once. No one's supposed to talk about that op. I know. That's why I don't. They stood in silence for a moment. The hum of low-power systems filled the space. Ellis took a sip of his coffee. When the reactor scrammed, we had less than 8 minutes of cooling left. You knew the containment was breached, and you went in anyway. She looked over. I didn't think I'd come out, but you did. He said, and so did the rest of us. 112 lives. That's what the final count was. We never got told what you did in there, only that you didn't ask permission. Madeline leaned back against the bulkhead. The containment unit was failing because of a design flaw in the override loop, a logic trap that fed the cooling feedback into a false normal state. The Navy engineers didn't know that loop existed. I wrote it as part of a redundancy test, and no one ever removed it before deployment. Ellis exhaled slowly. That's why you walked in. You weren't guessing. She nodded. I didn't go in to be brave. I went in because I knew exactly what was breaking. You disappeared after that. We thought maybe you were dead. Some thought you were buried in a black program. Maybe I was. She said. Maybe I still am. Ellis didn't say anything else. He just stood with her a while longer. In the dim red glow of the bay, surrounded by cables and code and memories no one could speak of, they shared a kind of quiet that didn't need words. The kind earned only in places few people ever see, and fewer survive. By Eros 6:12 the next morning, Madeline had narrowed it down to a single segment buried inside a legacy logic tree no one had reviewed since the system's commissioning. The propulsion system wasn't broken. It was behaving exactly as it had been instructed to. A protocol, obscure and deeply nested, had triggered an intentional full stop once the ship crossed into a precise geo-fenced coordinate grid latitude and longitude matching a strip of contested water near the Spratlys. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the code for a long time, unmoving. Then, quietly, she started pulling up the system logs from the moment Liberty Dawn had entered the perimeter. The command string matched perfectly. It hadn't been triggered remotely. It hadn't been hacked. It had simply waited. Years. For the ship to pass the line. Commander Rourke entered the engineering bay at 0634. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture rigid. Admiral Danner followed 2 minutes later, called in personally from Indopacom Command. Word had gotten around that the propulsion team was no longer in control of the situation, and that a civilian was. They approached her as she scrolled through lines of command history, pausing only to isolate activation keys. What are we looking at? Ms. Rivers Rourke asked. She kept her eyes on the screen. The system wasn't compromised. It was following orders. Danner stepped closer. Whose orders? That's what I'm trying to find out. She pulled up a mirrored thread on a second monitor, showing activation criteria buried under redundant error handlers. This isn't an error state. It's a conditional failsafe. When the carrier crossed this exact grid square, the system entered dormant lock. You're saying the propulsion shutdown was deliberate? Rourke asked. Not sabotage. Not a cyber attack. Correct? It wasn't external. This behavior was baked into the base architecture years ago. The only thing that changed was location. You hit the tripwire. Danner's face darkened. That kind of logic doesn't belong in a forward-deployed warship. She turned to face them. It was never supposed to be used in a warship. She walked them through the logic tree, her voice calm but clipped. The code had no malicious payload, no destruction path, no data theft. It simply disabled the propulsion kernel when specific variables were met. Coordinate match, threat level above threshold, and no external override. It was a shutoff valve. The system wasn't broken. It was protecting itself from doing something it wasn't designed to do. Rourke didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened as he traced the implications. This could have gotten us killed, or worse. This almost triggered a conflict. And someone wrote that in. She nodded slowly, and whoever inherited the code didn't understand what they were inheriting. At 0715, she isolated the string's author signature. It was an internal tag, hard to spoof, unique to the original system designer, and in that moment, She knew what came next. Subpart Patong Doi. The room emptied down to essential personnel. Admiral Danner dismissed the outside observers. Only Rourke, Chief Mitchell, and 2 ComSec officers remained. Madeline stood quietly as the Admiral circled to face her. I want a straight answer. Right now. Did you write that failsafe? She met his eyes. Yes. Rourke stepped forward, his tone sharper. You embedded code that disabled a carrier if it crossed into a combat zone. And you didn't tell anyone. No. I embedded a safeguard to shut down navigation if the system was being misused. It wasn't intended for combat applications. The system you're using was originally built for long-range autonomous travel, space-bound prototypes. That was the original intent. Then why is it sitting in my engine room, Rourke asked. Because the Navy bought the rights. After I refused to strip the controls, they assigned the work to someone else. I was removed from the program. Danner's eyes narrowed. So this was your protest? Your way of making a point? No. This was my way of not becoming complicit. The original system was designed to think ahead to reject unsafe or unauthorized behavior. That logic stayed behind, buried under layers of modifications. Rourke ran a hand down his face. So you're telling me this wasn't a bug. It was a choice. It was insurance, she said. For scenarios exactly like this, where a system designed for exploration was forced into conflict. The room was quiet. Outside, the low hum of deck activity continued, muffled and distant. Finally, Mitchell spoke. Can you disable it? She nodded. Yes, because I wrote it. But if anyone else tries, the system will brick. I never expected to be the one to fix it. But I knew the logic wouldn't accept a foreign override. Danner crossed his arms. You understand the implications of what you've done. You brought this ship to a halt in contested waters. You handed our enemies a potential advantage. She kept her voice even. And I'm the one making sure it doesn't happen again. Rourke exhaled hard. If you can get us back online, do it. But after that, there's going to be a very long conversation with the Pentagon. Her eyes didn't flinch. Understood. At 07:42, she turned back to the terminal, hands moving with new urgency. The Admiral stepped back, watching her carefully. She wasn't a saboteur, and she wasn't an engineer anymore. She was something else, something none of them had a name for yet. But if she could bring Liberty Dawn back from dead weight to operational readiness, they weren't going to stop her. Not today. At 02:16, the propulsion bay lights flickered. Not a fault. A system sync ripple. Madeline sat cross-legged in the maintenance cradle, hands steady, eyes fixed on a narrow strip of code scrolling across the display. No one else spoke. Chief Mitchell watched from 10 feet away, arms crossed, not daring to interrupt. She'd been in this spot for 36 hours. No breaks. Just black coffee and data streams. At 02:21, the carrier shuddered softly. A subtle vibration hummed up through the deck plating. The engineers froze. A low whine followed, then a faint tremor as the Q-core spun up from deep idle. On screen, propulsion vectors flickered green. It was alive. For the first time in 3 days, the Liberty Dawn had thrust. Madeline didn't smile. She just leaned forward and entered a final sequence of commands. System confirmation loaded one line at a time. No errors, no alerts. Then she exhaled once, slowly. She disconnected the manual interface, slid the access panel shut, and stood up. Her knees cracked. No one moved. She didn't say it was fixed, didn't explain how, just knelt, packed her tools into the worn leather bag, and zipped it closed like she'd done this 100 times. Mitchell finally stepped forward. The system's stable. She nodded once, running at 94%. That will rise as it rebalances. At 02:29, the room exhaled in unison. Engineers leaned back against bulkheads, some laughing quietly. One whispered near the rear of the bay. She didn't reboot it. She rewrote it. Someone else muttered. She speaks the system's native tongue. and no one argued. Admiral Danner arrived at 0234. He entered just as she tightened the last strap on her bag. He opened his mouth to speak, but paused, then said only, "Thank you." She met his eyes, then glanced at the monitors, now glowing steady green. Then she turned and left, without a word. Subpart 15.2. By Aero 3, Aero 5, the flight deck was windswept and dim. A single Seahawk idled on standby, rotor blades rotating lazily in the humid air. Madeline walked across the deck alone, her bag slung over one shoulder, boots clicking softly against the non-skid surface. The catapults beside her remained dormant, but the carrier beneath her was once again alive. Master Chief Ellis stood at attention near the island tower. No one had ordered him there. No formation was called, but as she neared the helo, one sailor beside him straightened, then another, then a petty officer, one by one, without signal or instruction. Engineers and deckhands stopped what they were doing and stood at quiet attention. Some held coffee, some held tools. All of them let them fall to their sides. She slowed as she passed, eyes flicked toward her, but no one spoke. No salute was ordered, but one began. Ellis brought his hand up first, clean, crisp. A moment later, others followed. A wave of silent respect spread down the length of the deck like wind through canvas. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't on any roster. But when the Navy's most advanced warship was dead in the water on the brink of international disaster, she walked in with nothing but a leather bag and rewrote the code that no one else could even read. This emotional, high-stakes military story follows Madeline Rivers, a mysterious civilian with a hidden past, as she steps aboard the USS Liberty Dawn and changes everything. Based on real-world military protocols and systems, this story blends technical accuracy with powerful storytelling to reveal what it truly means to serve with no uniform, no rank, and no recognition. Paused near the boarding ramp, looked across the line of faces, and for the first time, her expression cracked just slightly. Not a smile, just a breath caught behind the eyes. Then she returned the salute. One sharp motion, held for 2 seconds, then dropped. At 0310, she climbed into the Seahawk. No fanfare, no escort. The door slid shut behind her. The rotors accelerated, pushing air down over the silent crew. And just like that, she was gone. No one moved until the sound faded into the night. Then slowly, the sailors lowered their hands. Nobody said a word. They didn't have to. Every person on that deck knew they had just witnessed something rare. Not orders followed, not glory sought, just a quiet act of brilliance paid in time, grit, and sacrifice. At 0817 the next morning, a secured briefing room in the Pentagon buzzed with tension. Screens flickered with satellite feeds, system logs, and redacted transmission records from the USS Liberty Dawn. Rear Admiral Forsyth stood at the head of the room, arms locked behind his back as he reviewed the new intelligence. The propulsion failure hadn't been sabotaged by a foreign state. The embedded shutdown protocol traced back to a subcontracted module written 8 years ago by a private contractor operating out of Malaysia. The protocol had been modified just enough to look like a failsafe, but deeper analysis showed it carried conditional escalation flags. If the system remained disabled for more than 72 hours, it would have broadcast a false telemetry signature resembling a Chinese naval strike. It was designed to provoke a response. One official called it a digital false flag. A colonel from Cyber Command shook his head. This wasn't an error. It was a trap. A ticking one. A 2-day difference in detection could have lit up the entire Pacific. A civilian intervened, unscheduled, unauthorized, and she disabled it. Someone asked for her background. It was minimal. Records showed she had been a systems architect on autonomous AI propulsion programs, but her personnel file ended abruptly 4 years ago. No discharge, no retirement, just a blank space. One official suggested surveillance. Another wanted her classified as an internal threat. But Admiral Tennant, seated quietly at the rear of the room, finally spoke. If she hadn't touched that core, We'd be dragging wreckage out of the South China Sea right now. He held up a single page, the last entry from the ship's systems log, authored by her. Single line patch. She didn't hide anything. She fixed it and walked away. The room fell into an uneasy silence. What none of them said aloud was that she'd outmaneuvered them all. Not politically. Technically. They depended on systems they no longer understood, and she was the one person who still could. Later that evening, just past sunset, Commander Rourke stood near the portside rail. The sky glowed orange, darkening into blue. Master Chief Ellis joined him without speaking. The flight deck was mostly quiet now, save for the low whine of jet turbines far below. Rourke didn't look over, just said, "She wasn't there for recognition." Ellis nodded slowly. She was there because no one else could do it. They stood in silence, wind sweeping past. Somewhere beyond the horizon, she was gone. No commendation, no report, just the whisper of a system running smooth, and a ship that owed its life to someone no one really knew.